In this recording, we're going to look at Print Limited, which is focused on the traditional costing and also activity-based costing. So again, I've assumed you've read through the question. If not, pause this and read through it fully and try and get the practice now of reading exactly what's been asked in terms of each requirement, but also then highlighting key information as you read down through the question. So for example here, our first key requirement is calculate the full cost. So you'd highlight what's full cost and profit per unit for both products or both printers, using a traditional costing system based on labour hours. So some of these are the key words you're trying to look for. What do I have to do? I have to do full cost and profit per unit based on the traditional system. So just trying to get more discipline, because some people may have not read exam questions and whatnot in a while. Get that practice of reading exactly what your deliverable is. And again, I'm assuming you've read through the question, but a couple of things to highlight here is they're both based on two different markets. You have the domestic market for standard, and deluxe is based in the office market or the office environment. Both of them have special parts difficult to handle. One standard has only one, but deluxe has four. There are different batch sizes, and also there's now a focus on management to sell more of the deluxe printer because they believe deluxe is more profitable. So that gives us the context of what we're going to do the question with, and we're going to be using that for our narrative. So as you move on to harder and harder questions, the next 2 or 3 questions in the pack, you'll see more narrative information giving you more context. So what we're going to look at now is, again, part 1, the cost and the profit per unit based on traditional system. Now, hopefully you know what the full cost. The full cost is going to be made up of your direct cost and your indirect cost. Now, in indirect cost, we often call that overhead. So the way we're going to split it out here, we actually have two direct costs. Here we have direct materials and direct labour. And the indirect cost, then we know we have a single overhead of 333,200. But for the traditional system, we only use the single bucket or the single cost pool. We don't split it out. We only split it out when we go to activity-based costing. So be careful what you are asked. And we're looking then for standard and we're looking for deluxe. Alright, so we'll just make that smaller. So what we're looking at here, the materials are quite straightforward. The cost of materials, just be careful you're taking the right figure, 22 and 32 for both standard and deluxe, coming straight from the table. Now, unlike the previous question you've done in class in terms of OLATA, you're not given the direct labour cost per unit. So this is why I'm trying to bring in new things you mightn't have seen. I've underlined it to help you identify it. That's the direct labour cost per hour. And if standard takes 2 hours, the labour cost per unit will be 2 times 8. So it's actually going to be 16 there. So remember, we're getting the cost per unit here. So that means the direct cost per unit is 38. You can easily trace €38 to every standard printer for materials and for the labour. For deluxe, it's slightly higher. It is 2.5 hours times 8. So they use slightly longer, and that will be €20 a unit for labour, and the direct cost will then be 52. So just be careful, I didn't give you the direct labour cost per unit, in which case you could have directly put it in. Here you had to do a small bit more work. So that's the first element of our total cost. This is all on a per unit basis. What we're missing now is these in yellow. Right. If I was using the right one. Is we're trying to figure out what is the indirect cost. Right. Often again we call this the overhead. And our problem is here we have 333,200 of overheads. But in the traditional system, which we're asked in part 1, we're only going to allocate that based on a single cost driver. So we'll come down here a second. You have the overheads are 333,200, and if the driver is labour hours. So it doesn't always have to be labour hours. It can depend on the question, but this one we kept it similar to the OLATA question. Direct labour hours. So the first thing we have to figure out is how many direct labour hours do we have in total. So the total labour hours, you go back, will be 12,000 units of standard at 2 hours each, plus 12,000 units of deluxe at 2.5 hours each. Because remember now, there is only two products in this company similar to Alata, that means the total hours of the company will be just the volume times the hours per unit. So go back where we're looking at. We have a single bucket of costs, we have a single driver, and we want to allocate them accordingly. Now I know you can do your quick percentages, but it's no harm to go out to understand exactly what we're doing. So the total hours there, 54,000 total labour hours. So that's what we call our cost driver. So our cost driver here is a single driver, total labour hours, and we got 54,000. And to get our rate then, or what we call our absorption rate, you get the level of overheads, the 332, and you divide it by the total labour hours. And that's going to tell us, for every labour hour worked, how much overhead are you allocating. And hopefully you're going to get somewhere around €6.17. So we're not going to be too worried about rounding, but around 6.17 should be fine. All right. So what that means is, for every labour hour worked, a unit should get allocated 6.17 of overhead costs. So say for every hour that's worked, for every labour hour that's worked, you're going to allocate 6.17 euros of overheads to cover the overheads as well. So we're assuming there that labour hours are related to overhead consumption. Okay. Now just be careful. Here I'm not going to round. So I'm just going to use the figure here as it is, because that's a lot more. So in a question you might round, you might slightly different answer, that's fine. We're not going to dock marks in terms of rounding there. So your indirect cost here, that is going to be 2 times the 6.17. So somewhere around 12.34. Now I said if you round, you might get a slightly different one, but it's 12.34 is the allocation there. And similarly here, it will be careful, it will be 2.5. Because it's 2.5 hours, and that means you're going to allocate 2.5 worth of €6.17. So we now have our two costs. We have our direct cost and our indirect cost, our overhead, and when you add them together, that gets your total cost for standard will be 50.34, and your total cost for deluxe will be 67.43. So that's your approach to the traditional system. You have a single bucket of costs, a single driver. You then get your sales price, which you're given in the question. You're actually selling a standard unit for 65. You're selling this for 87. And that gets your profit per unit. So remember, you are asked for both if you go back to the question. Full cost and profit per unit. Profit per unit here then is your selling price minus your full cost. So you can call that total cost, or you can call it full cost. And the same here, 19.57. So what we can see here is on a per unit basis, and remember you sell the same amount of standard units as you sell deluxe. Deluxe is more profitable. And that's what we're talking about here when they're trying to promote the deluxe over the standard product, because they believe it's the more profitable product in their portfolio. So that kind of the narrative aligns to your calculations there. So that's our first part answered, part 1. Calculate the cost, full cost, otherwise known as total cost, and calculate the profit per unit. So part B here asks you, and watch this word critically discuss. That means discuss the pros and cons. So you need to critically discuss this approach to costing both products. And again, watch for the wording in light of the information above. That means use the information above to justify your points. Now, you can go back and have a look at the solution here because it's worded out. But I'm just trying to show you, critically discuss, well, what's good about it? Well, what's good about it here in quite simplistic terms is it's quick, it's simple, it should be easy enough to understand. So if you have some basic knowledge of accounting, it's relatively easy, say one bucket and one driver. But on the other hand, and this is the key point students had to note, it's probably too simplistic. Why? Because it's not going to capture the complexity that you have in the activity table. The difference in hours, there's not that much of a difference, 2 hours and 2.5 hours. Whereas you come down to the difference in the use of special parts. And we know that's a key cost pool up here, in terms of material handling or special part handling. The difference in the size of the batch sizes, which can link to setups. The difference in the number of material issues, which is none here, sorry, so that doesn't really make much of a difference. But the difference, that's per batch, so it could have a difference in the number of batches you have to calculate. And the difference in the number of sales invoices, they are all completely different than what you have in terms of your relationship between the two labour usages. So that means a simplistic single cost driver may not capture the actual complexity of the activities. And that's what a big limitation that is. So have a look. You don't expect too much written, but have a look at the suggested solution. Just a simple paragraph, a couple of bullet points will suffice in terms of an answer there. So that then moves us on to part 2. And the first part is actually asking you, discuss what the appropriate cost drivers are for each pool of costs. So unlike in OLATA, where we tell you exactly what the drivers are, what I've done here is I've given you the cost pools, which I'll just copy over. Right. So you have your cost pools there. But what you also have as well then is you have a number of pieces of information here about activity analysis. But I don't link them. So you have to try and make that link in terms of, there's your cost pool, and this is your driver. So you have to try and figure out what driver is relevant for each one. So the setup costs, the overall overhead is 332. That doesn't change. 73,000 of that is related to setup costs. So what we're going to say is, naturally enough, hopefully the number of setups is the obvious driver there. Sometimes there might be subjectivity. Other times it should be relatively straightforward from the question. The best driver for that pool would be the number of setups, because the more setups means you have more setup costs. Then special part handling. Well, in this case, you have the number of special parts per unit. Again, hopefully relatively straightforward. Now you have to calculate those and do them out, but for now, it hopefully should be okay. Customer invoicing, number of sales invoices. The last one, that should be a good indicator of the more invoices you have, the more costs in that cost pool. Material handling, the number of material issues. And that should link back. And the last one is other. Now you have a bit of subjectivity here. You might do any of those above, but what I'm going to stick with is labour hours, because when we don't have anything more specific, we may as well use the one that was previously used on the basis that it has some value to the overheads. But if you had an alternative one that you put in and you can justify it, that's fine as well. I'm not as concerned about the last one. That's really a catch-all one for whatever is left. So we have our cost pools now, and we have our driver. And that was our first part here, discuss. Now, I haven't discussed what you'd be expected with maybe a line or two for each one, but most of these are relatively self-explanatory based on the information that's given. The second part of this now is asking you, similar enough to part 1, it's calculate the full cost and profit per unit, now using activity-based costing. And we said now, remember from the lecture, the main change from traditional to activity is you're now focused on the activities. So what you're going to have is multiple cost pools, or what we call buckets, and you're going to have multiple drivers. So instead of doing one single bucket and one single driver, which the traditional was, you're now in this case going to have 5 buckets and 5 drivers. So it just takes a bit longer, but the logic being, if you go more granular, you should hopefully get more accurate details and more accurate pricing then as well. So the next thing we have to do then is we have to figure out, well, if we have the cost pools, we need the total of each of these drivers to actually allocate it out, because otherwise we can't allocate across. So what I'm going to do now is, just to make this a bit bigger, I'm going to pull up the Excel, but we're working off this table here. We're figuring out how many setups do we have, how many batch sizes, etc. Right? So let's firstly look at the number of setups. Right? Now there's a bit of a step here. You have to get the batch size and then the setups per batch. So there's 2 parts to this. So for standard, for example, you have 12,000 units overall. If the batch size is 1,000, that means you have 12 batches to make all your standard. So be careful on that. It's going to be 12,000 batches, or 12,000 units divided by 1,000. So the number of batches here are going to be 12. So in terms of deciding the setup, the number of setups, we're going to go, which they're called is standard and deluxe. Standard, deluxe. The number of setups here will be 12 times 1. Where that's coming from is there's 12 batches, 12 times 1,000 gets you number of batches, and the setups per batch are only 1. The number of batches now for deluxe is slightly different. They still have to make 12,000 units, but you're told above small batches for deluxe. So that means you're making a lot more batches, there's a lot more setups. So the number of batches is going to be 12,000 divided by 50. So I'll just do this down here. 12,000 divided by 50. You have 240 batches for deluxe. Because they do so much, the batches are so small, you have to do so many of them. And of course the problem is there's a number of setups, machines, etc. in each one. So it's actually going to be 240 times 3 here. So that is equal to 12. Whereas for the deluxe, the number of setups is actually going to be 720. So the total then of this cost driver is 732. Now again, you may have quicker ways to do this, but you still have to show it because you may need for other parts of the question. You'll see as you go on to other exam questions, there may be quicker and faster ways to do it, but make sure you start with the longer part so you understand each step. So to get the setups, you get the number of batches first, which are divided by the batch size, and then you get the times the number of setups. For special parts then, if we go back, 1 special part per unit for standard, 4 special parts for deluxe. So here it's 12,000 units times 1, which is 12,000. Let's make those a bit bigger. And then for deluxe, it's going to be 12,000 units times 4, which is 48,000. So 60,000 special parts overall. So it's just to work through so you know exactly where the figures are coming from. And this is a step on from our ladder where we give it to you directly. We're now making you do a bit more calculation and even getting you to think about how things happen in practice. So what's a batch size? How do we link that back? Customer invoicing on the number of invoices, they're given directly in the question. So it's 50 and 240. There's no adjustment to be made. It's not per unit or anything like that. So 50 here, 240 means the total is 290. That's fine. Number of material issues, 1 per batch for each one. And we know there's 12 batches here. So 12 times 1 is 12. And we know there's 240 batches here. 240 times 1 is 240. So there's 1 material issue for each batch of standard, 1 material issue for each batch of deluxe. But we know they have different batch sizes. That means they have different numbers of batches. So the total there is 252. And last but not least, then labour hours we've done already. The labour hours will be 12,000 times 2 for standard is 24,000. And it's going to be 12,000 times 2.5, which will be, what's that, 30,000. So we know this from before, the total labour hours are 54,000. So it's a small bit repetitive, but it's no harm to practice. You know where the calculations are coming from. Some students will fly through that, other students might take a small bit longer. But either way, make sure you understand exactly where the figures are coming from and how to allocate them out. The last step then before we move on to actually allocating costs out, some of you may think straight away, well, I'll get that portion of the total and multiply by the cost. That's fine. We'll do it the longer way because it can be useful when you're doing activity-based management. So once you have the costs, once you have the total driver, you're now going to get the cost per driver. So it means what's the cost of one setup? Well, if the total cost is 732 and the total setups were 73,200, should I say, divided by 732, that means the cost per setup here is 100. So right there per setup. So the more setups you have, there's roughly €100 of overheads going towards that. And that can be useful to quantify that when you're trying to deal with activity-based management, which will come in the next session. Same logic here, 60,000 costs for special parts, and there's actually 60,000 special parts. So that means the overhead cost of a special part is 1. 60,000 divided by 60,000, so it's 1 per special part. The more special parts a product has, an extra euro it's getting. Next one, it'll be 29,000 for invoicing, and there was 290 invoices done, so 100 euro per invoice. Material issues, there was 63,000 for material handling, and there was 252 material issues. So we're saying the average cost of each material issue was 250 euro per issue. And finally then, for the other overheads, it's the 108 divided by the 54. It's 2 euro per labour hour. So these are what we call then the rate of allocation. Right? So whatever way you want to look at it, they're important now because they're what we're going to be able to allocate the costs to standard and to deluxe. There's a couple of logical steps then each time. You get the cost pools, you get the total cost drivers. That then brings you to the cost per driver. And that can be useful if you're planning, right, if we cut our sales invoices next year, how much are we going to save? Or if we try and do bigger batch sizes for deluxe, how much might we save in setup costs? So you can use that to quantify for activity-based management and it can be quite helpful. Your next step then is to say, well, if we have that, we need to allocate these costs to standard and deluxe. We can't allocate on a per unit basis straight away. We go on total basis first. So if we come down here, we're going to do standard and we're going to do deluxe. So let's put this over, put this one here. And what we're going to do then is take each one. Take all the overheads, setup costs, special ordering, etc. And we're going to allocate out the costs. So we'll know, and I leave these here as a reminder, we know what the total costs are. This is what we're trying to allocate then to standard and deluxe, because remember, direct costs are fine. What we're trying to allocate is the two indirect costs. So for setup costs, go back again, we know it's 100 euro per setup. Standard uses 12 setups. So standard is going to be 100 times 12, which is 1200. Deluxe, on the other hand, they use 720 setups, so it's going to be 100 times 720. So you're just allocating them out pro rata, and that's going to be 7,200. Let's double check. 100 euro per setup plus 100 times 720 is 72,000. So most of the setup costs, again double check, because standard plus deluxe equals our total. That only holds because we have a 2-product company. If we had more than that, it wouldn't necessarily hold. So you see, because deluxe uses a lot more setups, it gets a lot more of the allocation. And that's a lot different than what you would have done with labour hours. Special parts, it's 1 euro per special part. They get 12,000. Deluxe get 48. So this is 1 times 12,000. And this is going to be 1 times 48,000. So again, completely different allocation for both. It's all based on the more of the activity you consume, the more of the cost allocation you get. Some of you may be quicker, and that's fine. You can jump ahead. Others want to take it step by step for the first couple. Customer invoicing, we're going to allocate based on 100 euro per invoice. 50 invoices in standard, but a lot more invoices in deluxe. So they have a lot more smaller sales orders. So here, you have 50 times 100 for customer invoicing for standard, and then you're going to have 100 euro per order and 240 orders. 240 times 100. So this will be 24,000, and this is going to be 5,000. Right, so again, you're just allocating, because deluxe uses a lot more of each of them, they get a lot more of the cost. And then material handling is 250 per issue, 12 issues and 240 issues. So this will be 250 times 12. This will be 250 times 240. And again, double check the amount you've allocated to standard plus the amount you've allocated to deluxe is still the total. They have to go somewhere. You're allocating them based on accurate cost drivers. Lastly then, you're allocating the other overheads on €2 per labour hour. This is 24,000 times 2, which is 48,000. And this then is going to be 30,000 times 2, which is 60,000. And 48 plus 60 gives you your 108 total. But notice what we're looking at now. This was the traditional driver. So you can nearly say it's nearly half and half split if you're looking at labour hours. But when we bring in other drivers, there's nowhere near a half and half split because deluxe uses a lot more of each of the activities. So we say there deluxe are a lot more resource intensive. So what we do then is we tot up how much do we allocate to standard, 69,200, and that's across 12,000 units. How much do we allocate to deluxe, 264, and that's also across 12,000 units. Both of them just happen to have the same amount of units. So what that allows us to do then is you're going to get an indirect cost per unit, which we will need to do our analysis. So the indirect cost is just the total divided by the number of units. So here it'll be 69,200 divided by 12,000. And that's going to be about 5.77. So again, if you're rounding, that's fine. Just around 5.77. Whereas for deluxe, it's going to be 264,000 divided by 12,000. Which is about €22. See, is there any rounding? Exactly €22. Now, they are the two figures we're going to update in our cost analysis. We did it previously and we allocated out different figures. For the previous example, if you go back to part A, we allocated 12 and 15. So nearly half and half. This is completely different now. You're nearly allocating 4 times as much to deluxe as you are to standard. And remember, that's the first part of the question. You then have to finish off and say, well, what's the direct cost? What's the indirect cost? And that gets you the full cost for standard and for deluxe. Remember, as we did in class, the direct cost does not change. That's as per 1. Direct cost is the same. If we go up, the direct cost for standard was 38 materials and labour and 52 for deluxe. So 38 and 52. However, the indirect cost is now 577 and 22. That's the one that changes because what has changed is your allocation method. So your full cost there now is 43.77 and your full cost is €74 for deluxe. Now the last part, we'll compare them to the previous answer to see what the implications are, but that is a significant change. And the main driver here is the indirect cost. Based on your assumptions of how you allocate it will dictate what the full cost is. The sales price does not change. It is still as per the question, 65 and 87. But what will change is the profit per unit. Why? Because your costs have changed. Standard is now €21 profit per unit, whereas deluxe is now only 13. So the costing, although sale price hasn't changed, the profitability has, because your actual costing is now more accurate because you're using activity-based costing. All right, so that is the answer to part 2B. Calculate the full cost and profit per unit for standard and deluxe. Now, as we can see here, there's a couple of steps, and there is a bit of computation here. Your starting point is to get the cost pools, which you have here, and determine what the relevant cost drivers are. So that's your first part. Once you have that, then you get the cost per driver, which is useful in its own right for activity-based management. And you then use those individual costings to be able to allocate to standard based on how much of each activity it uses, and to deluxe. And then we work back from the totals to the units at the very end. So there is a method to, and the more questions you do the OLATA question, this question, and go on to the next couple of questions in the pack. It can get a bit repetitive, and that can be helpful to understand exactly what you're doing. The last piece then, and I'm just going to hide this so we can come back and compare and contrast. So they do ask you to compare and contrast at the end. So just hide this, and we'll see, we can compare and contrast both of them. So we'll just tidy this up a bit and bring these over one. So we can see here under the traditional system, the cost was 50 and 67. Under the ABC system, the cost is 43 and 74. So you compare them there, these two and these two. So what we can say there, and you can see the writing in a bit more detail, the traditional system under costs deluxe. The true cost is 74. The traditional system is only 67. Whereas for standard, it's overcosted. The true cost should only be 43. So that is why deluxe looks so profitable. Deluxe looks the more profitable in the traditional system that they currently use. And that's why the management team want to focus on selling deluxe more and more of that unit. Whereas if you go to the ABC system like we've done here, the profit is a lot smaller. Right? Standard is nearly double, close to double the profit of deluxe because the costing system has changed. So when you're doing an answer like that, it's always useful at the very start because you're asked to, in the question, comment on the reasons for the difference and the implications. Well, the reasons for the differences are your assumption around your cost allocation. In this method, we just assumed it's based on labour hours. In the ABC method, we've gone a lot more detailed. All right. And when you go back and have a look at the suggested solution, it's always useful to do a little table out. And you just put the traditional and you put the ABC side by side for standard and deluxe. So you can show exactly for the cost and maybe for the profit what's going on. So it's nice to get little marks of that in terms of presentation and people can see where it's coming from. So for example, before you started your commentary for the last part, you'd say, well, the traditional costing system would have said the costs are 50.4 and 67.34. Whereas, bear with me. Whereas for the ABC system, they're 43 and 74. So by doing a little summary table, because you'll have a lot of your calculations on other pages, it makes it very easy to comment now to say, deluxe is undercosted using the traditional, and standard was overcosted. And that meant the implication is you're coming to the wrong decision about which one you should promote in terms of your sales mix. And you'll come to the same conclusions then in terms of your profitability as well, if you wanted to put them in. Under the traditional costing system, deluxe looked a lot more profitable, but actually when you redid the costings in the ABC system, standard looks like the most profitable product that perhaps should be promoted more than deluxe. So what we're looking for is your ability to use those numbers and to give some relevant insight. So that is looking at the print limited question from your question pack. So make sure you go back over that, be happy with the OLATA question and the print question, and then you're going to move on to the other questions in that question pack, and you'll have further questions throughout the semester.